Good evening, everybody. Before we get started, I would just like to remind you that if you find this study helpful and beneficial, like it and share it with other people. The more people that you share it with, that helps spread the message because YouTube will actually promote it more if we have more clicks on it. Also, remember that we are now putting verse lists down in the comment section so that you can download the verse list to look up later. I will try to go back to some of the past messages and do that. And also, as usual, remember the kids in Haiti, which I have a link on the YouTube page so that you can go help them out and take a look at what's going on there at our Father's house. Tonight, we're going to start in Revelation chapter 11, verse 9. This is out of the NET Bible. For 3.5 days, those from every people, tribe, nation, and language will look at their corpses because they will not permit them to be placed in a tomb. And this is talking about the two witnesses in Revelation. G.H. Lang was an English preacher, author, and biblical scholar who was born in 1874. Now, as a biblical scholar, he refused to accept traditional interpretations of the Bible unless he was convinced that the traditional view was correct and accurate. So this obviously doesn't mean that he was always correct, but it means that he searched the scriptures daily as those in Berea recommended for doing. Well, his church ran him out for so-called heresy. Well, what was his sin? He taught that this passage right here, this prophecy, when it was fulfilled, would not require a miracle. He taught that technology would one day make it so that the whole earth could view these events just as a course of normal events, nothing special about seeing it. Well, he lived long enough to see that technology in the form of TV. He died in 1958. The first artificial satellite, which was Sputnik 1, was launched in 1957. The first communication satellite, which is part of Project SCORE, was launched in 1958. And Telstar, which broadcast transatlantic television signals, was launched in 1962, so just 3 years after his death, or 4 years after his death. And in 1963, CENTCOM 2 was placed into a geosynchronous orbit, and that way it was always going to be broadcasting instead of having to find a signal. Now, prior to the space age in 1951, the U.S. Naval Research Laboratory began a project named Communication Moon Relay, in which they used the moon as a passive relay to send transoceanic communication between DC and Hawaii. And they achieved their first transoceanic message in January of 1956. This is all before Lang died. He was run out of his church for saying this, and he saw it come to fruition. But this is just one example from history as to why we have to be careful about limiting God's prophecies based upon our current understanding of science and physics, or at least the science and physics of which we, the public, are aware. One example of that is something that I stumbled across recently. In the past, people have asked me, they said, brother, who can they influence, or how can they influence the whole world as long as we're not susceptible to psychological manipulation? Well, first of all, no matter how much preparation, you can't guarantee that you're not going to be susceptible to psychological manipulation. Therefore, it's important to have a healthy and active prayer life to protect against that. But what I stumbled across recently, I found to be quite interesting. Now, this may be something that you're aware of. I was not aware of it, but it's not something new. This is from the National Library of Medicine, which is part of the National Institute of Health. And for context, this patent was granted in 2003, 22 years ago, so it's not something new. What does that patent summary say? It says a nervous system manipulation by electromagnetic fields from monitors. There's a link to this in the description, so you can see it on the government website where the patent was registered. This is not from some sort of conspiracy theory website or anything like that. It's from the U.S. government, and they self-describe this as nervous system manipulation through monitors. Let me read the entire abstract for you. Physiological effects have been observed in a human subject in response to stimulation of the skin with weak electromagnetic fields that are pulsed with certain frequencies near 1.2 hertz or 2.4 hertz, such as to excite a sensory resonance. Many computer monitors and TV tubes, when displaying pulse images, emit pulse electromagnetic fields of sufficient amplitudes to cause such excitation. It is therefore possible to manipulate the nervous system of a subject by pulsing images displayed on a nearby computer monitor or TV set. For the latter, the image pulsing may be embedded in the program material, or it may be overlaid by modulating a video stream, either as an RF signal or as a video signal. The image displayed on a computer monitor may be pulsed effectively by a simple computer program. For certain monitors, pulsed electromagnetic fields capable of exciting sensory resonances in nearby subjects may be generated even as the displayed images are pulsed with subliminal intensity. In other words, they can affect you from a distance. You don't think they would do that? Think about Ephesians 12:6 and who's controlling the show. We're warned about these things. It's not miraculous, or it's probably not miraculous. It's not necessarily miraculous. It can be done, and this is an old pattern. So why are we generally not aware of these things? Because we are human, and we're fractured, and they're demonic and they're unified. Now, we can't keep up with everything, no matter how hard we may try. They are many and they work together. And if you start making too many waves, you're going to be silenced through censorship or worse. Now, that doesn't mean that we should not work towards godly ends. We should study, we should know the enemy, and we should not ignore the scriptures. How much time do we waste in our daily lives? Sports, games, goofing off, things like that. There's nothing wrong with any of that. But it's a question of how much of that you do. Do you do that? Do you watch your favorite team every week? Or do you keep 12 TVs going with all the stats being cross-referenced so that you know everything about every player? After all, there are athletic events that are referenced in the Bible, and if the references were evil in and of themselves, they wouldn't be used as a positive example. Do you sit down every evening and watch 3 hours of entertainment, or do you read a book? Do you read a novel, or is it something edifying? So amusement is okay as long as it's not taken too far. The word amuse itself comes from muse, which means to think, and the prefix which is a negation, therefore it means to cause not to think. All of us need to not think every once in a while, but how much of that do we do? What do you do with your time? What do I do with my time? The finger points both ways, and I can improve. And that's my exhortation to both myself and to you, is that we can improve. Now, as part of our awareness of what's going on around us, I want to bring your attention to two modern examples of the Jezebel spirit that's loose in the world today. Now remember, demons are truly transgender, so they may not always find physical manifestation through women. These two examples I'm going to show are women, but there are men who exhibit the same Jezebel characteristics. If you've ever seen the movie Nefarious, which is a mostly accurate portrayal of demonic possession, the priest in that would be one who is exhibiting the Jezebel spirit, even though he is a man. Now, one example of the Jezebel spirit is Marianne Booty. I'm not sure how to pronounce her name, Budde, but she is the female bishop who was supposed to deliver a prayer at President Trump's inauguration. But instead, she gave a political speech that was pure heresy from a biblical perspective. Now, whether you agree with President Trump or not, this woman was fully in Jezebel mode, very visible and highly praised from every atheistic and demonic group that you could possibly imagine. I'm not going to post the links to their praise here. Some of them are quite vile in their praise of her, but you can search them out if you wish. Now, in her speech, she supported choice of gender identity, which we'll see is directly part of the worship that Jezebel was a priestess of. She spoke out in favor of mutilating children, strong support of the LGBTQ agenda, and she was pro-abortion. Now, based upon her criteria, Jesus and the 12 apostles would be prohibited from speaking at the national cathedral that she's in charge of. Now, she's a very high-profile example of this. The second example is more appalling and more pervasive at the local church level, but this is not quite as high profile of a person. Protestia, which is a website, is the first place that dug this up as far as I know. There's a link to this below. It's the first place that I heard about it. But the so-called Reverend Deborah McKnight, founder of the Urban Abbey, which is the United Methodist Church, gave a sermon. Many people call her an impostor, and I think that's a quite valid word. And the word impostor is a blend of impostor and pastor, and is used to refer to a false teacher, uh, which is somebody who is actively teaching a false doctrine. Apparently, there is or was a TV series called Impostor that's highly praised by the usual deviants, which they think it's a good idea to pervert the Bible, but I'm not talking about that. It's actually a term, Impostor. Now, according to her bio, she's passionate about connecting with the people and helping them grow in their faith, and an advocate for social justice, women's rights, and the LGBTQ plus community, where she seeks to heal the wounds that are created by conservative Christianity. In other words, she is openly anti-Christ. In a shirt that proudly proclaims the spirit of Jezebel, she delivered her sermon that excuses Jezebel's behavior and ends up praising it. Much of her praise stems from, well, others did it too, but she fails to notice that some repented and others were brutally punished for what they did. And in the sermon that I saw, she said that a Jezebel is any woman who is competent, attractive, and smart, just like Kamala Harris. She defends Jezebel's Asherah worship, or Asheroth worship, brother, and condemns Elijah's killing all the prophets of Baal. What he did was a bad thing, but what she did was great. This is a woman preaching at a Christian church, but we should just forgive. And his killing all those prophets was an unnecessary act of violence. Never mind that God said to do it. We shouldn't have done it. And she also seems to be angry that we don't use feminine language for God. She actually states, I worship Jezebel. And unrelated to Jezebel, she also praises Rachel when she sold her father's idols because that meant that she stood up to the patriarchy and defended her faith. She defended Rachel's paganism, saying that it was a good thing. Do you see a problem here? It gets worse. On the social media for Urban Abbey, which is the church that she founded, somebody posted, says, why does this crazy broad insist on leading a Christian church? I mean, why doesn't she just start her own demonic religion, call her group the Jezebelites? Now, this is quoted by a man, but there are women that present similar responses, so it's not just simple misogyny. There are men and women both making similar comments about her. And the wording of this may be rude, but it's a valid question. The responses, however, are very telling. The responses weren't, well, one of them said, sign me all the way up to be a Jezebelite. I thought I was done with organized religion, but finally one made just for me. Now, Jezebelite is my new word, by the way. I think Jezebelism and Jezebelite is a good word. Somebody else said, I would join your new religion. So they're all defending this. Now, I may post other examples later, but there are literally hundreds that come up on simple searches, and you can watch and hear them in their own words. But the pervasiveness is part of the problem. And they are, of course, very popular. Drag queens teaching children Sunday schools, preaching from the pulpit, and things such as that are very visible, but the subtle ones may be more dangerous because they blend into the background a bit more. And just after writing this, I was shown one of their so-called hymns from one of their churches that is called Quirky, Queer, and Wonderful, with all the children singing it. They always target the children. Remember that. When you're looking at the Jezebel spirit, they target the children. So with these examples, we're going to look at who the historical Jezebel was. And from whence does the Jezebel spirit originate? Now in Revelation 2:20, there's the admonition here that says, notwithstanding I have a few things against thee, because thou sufferest that woman Jezebel, which calleth herself a prophetess, to teach and to seduce my servants to commit fornication and to eat things that are sacrificed unto idols. So the spiritual Jezebel was a seductress to the church at Thyatira. As such, there has to be some parallelism between her and the historical Jezebel, otherwise she wouldn't be used as a type. And there's also going to be some parallelism between this church full of Ahabs and the historical Ahab. Now, historical Jezebel was a seductress of Israel. She was the daughter of Ethbaal, who was a king of Sidon. She married Ahab, who was the king of Israel. And as we move forward, keep in mind that she was not trying to get people to quit worshiping Yahweh. She was trying to get them to join the worship of Yahweh alongside the Baal worship. She was trying to join them together, not supplant it. Ethbaal was not only the king of Sidon, but he was a priest of Astarte. And moving forward, I'm going to use the name Astarte for this deity, although she is known by several names through different cultures, such as Inanna, Anat, Isis, Hera, Juno, Ishtar, Aphrodite, and possibly Asherah. The word Asherah is used both for the objects and as a name. It is a name she may or may not have been the same as Astarte, but one has a Phoenician origin and one has a Canaanite origin. But she has all these names. I'm going to use Astarte from here on out. She's also called the Queen of Heaven. We'll look at that in the Bible later, not tonight, but some of the time. But the title Queen of Heaven is a Babylonian concept which will become more prominent in the book of Revelation. However, you must understand the history in order to understand the imagery that is in the Bible. You have to know what they're talking about in order to understand what they're trying to say. The past will let you understand the future and the present. 1 Kings chapter 16, verses 29 through 31. And in the 38th year of Asa, king of Judah, began Ahab the son of Omri to reign over Israel. And Ahab the son of Omri reigned over Israel and Samaria 22 years. And Ahab the son of Omri did evil in the sight of the Lord above all that were before him. And it came to pass, as if it had been a light thing for him, to walk in the sins of Jeroboam the son of Nebat. And he took to wife Jezebel the daughter of Ethbaal, king of the Zidonians, and went and served Baal and worshipped him. Then 1 Kings 21, verses 25 through 26. But there was none like unto Ahab, which did sell himself to work wickedness in the sight of the Lord, whom Jezebel his wife stirred up. And he did very abominably in following idols, according to all things as did the Amorites, whom the Lord cast out before the children of Israel. Now, this is jumping ahead in our story a little bit, but it will all be explained by the time we finish. Not necessarily today, but by the time we finish. Jezebel, following in the footsteps of her father, was a priestess and prophetess of Baal worship. And remember, pagan practices involved giving oneself over to the demons. She was also a priestess of Astarte. And Jezebel brought this pagan practice from the Phoenicians and led all Israel into idolatry. Ahab went along with it. As a result of this marriage to this woman, and remember, they were told not to intermarry with the other nations, not because of racism, but because of their national gods. But because of this marriage to this woman from another nation, Ahab did sell himself to work wickedness and did very abominably in following idols. It says, as if it had been a light thing for him to walk in the sins of Jeroboam the son of Nebat. So Jeroboam was the first king of the northern kingdom of Israel after it had been divided. He led Israel into idolatry and apostasy, and this is called the sins of Jeroboam. It became a euphemism for disobedience to God. Jeroboam was an Ephraimite and he served Solomon. And because of Solomon's idolatry, the prophet Ahijah foretold that Jeroboam would rule over 10 of the 12 tribes. So after Solomon died, Jeroboam led a revolt against Rehoboam, who was Solomon's son, which resulted in the kingdom being divided. Now, Jeroboam feared that the people would return to Rehoboam if they continued their worship in Jerusalem, which was required under the law. So he set up 2 golden calves in Bethel and Dan. Now, calves represented Baal worship at the time, but it seems that they were not intended to replace Yahweh, but to replace Moses in the Exodus and to be an addition to Yahweh in the northern kingdom. More on that in the future. In 1 Kings 12:28, whereupon the king took counsel and made 2 calves of gold and said unto them, it is too much for you to go up to Jerusalem. Behold thy gods, O Israel, which brought thee up out of the land of Egypt. This direct violation of the first 2 commandments led the people into idolatry. And people say, well, we're supposed to obey the government, right? Depends on what the government's telling you to do. But this also changed their places of worship, which also violated God's direct command in Deuteronomy 12. He appointed priests from among all the people rather than from the tribe of Levi. And the human mind says, well, inclusion is a good thing. Proper context is a good thing. That's not where they told to get the priests. They were told to get the priests from the tribe of Levi, not from all the tribes. He was trying to appeal to the people. This is the doctrine of men. This is the doctrine of demons. People who try to defend it say, well, we don't want to discriminate, which is very similar to, yea, hath God said. Now, Jeroboam introduced a festival similar to the Feast of Tabernacles in order to solidify his control and lead the people away from God's appointed times. This is on the 15th day of the 8th month. Now, the Feast of Tabernacles is on the 15th day of the 7th month. And it's the last of the feast days, and it was to remind the Jews of their deliverance from Egypt and to foreshadow the works and actions of the coming Messiah. So this was supplanting what God had commanded on this. But these things set a precedent for the following kings who came after him to continue these practices that let them maintain control. And this ultimately led to the downfall of the northern kingdom and to their conquest by Assyria in 722 BC. Now, the destruction of Jeroboam's house and the exile of Israel were prophesied by Ahijah in 1 Kings 14, 10 through 11, and Amos 7, 9. We're not going to read those, but this is all prophesied before it happened. Jeroboam's legacy is disobedience and apostasy. That's what he left to the world. And they're used as a warning against the dangers of disobedience and leading others into disobedience. Faithfulness is of utmost importance to anybody if you want to live a godly life. And Ahab followed in Jeroboam's disobedience. This was a perfect opportunity for Jezebel to get what she wanted. Now, the goddess that she worshipped was known as the Queen of Heaven. This Queen of Heaven was part of the lights in the sky. Some stories list the moon as her father and the sun as her brother, the sun god, which we're going to see him in this whole study too. But the light in the sky with which she is associated is what we call Venus today. She was a goddess of love, sexuality, destruction, and war. Try to tell me those four things are not all connected. But her depictions involved all the emotions with which those would be connected: pride, rage, passion, an insatiable sexual desire, impulsive, greedy, and vindictive. If she didn't get her way, she would cause havoc and destruction. And if she was offended, she became violent. She was a vengeful god, as were so many of the false gods. She would break the rules and she would destroy the standards and she would demand that which was not hers. She broke into the world of the dead, into hell, and threatened that if the other gods didn't give in to her demands, that she would release the dead back into the world of the living. She was the goddess of prostitution. In ancient Mesopotamia, the prostitutes considered her to be their patron, and she was pictured as having taken on the attributes of a prostitute, their manner of dress, and what they did. Our modern churches want to be family friendly, so they kind of gloss over the passages about fornication, adultery, prostitution, things like that. And the people in the churches, therefore, only have a very vague concept of what the Bible is teaching. But this goddess was also the goddess of taverns, the beer joint goddess, I guess. But it was mixed with intoxication and sensuality. When studying about Rahab, this little side note here on the taverns and the sensuality, but when studying about Rahab, she's called a harlot. But it's also suggested that the word should be innkeeper. The two may have been synonymous at the time because of the connection with Astarte and taverns. Now, that doesn't mean that you should avoid the Holiday Inn when you're on vacation. Holiday Inn's probably okay, depends on the part of town. But you should understand the context as given here in the story. She may have been a harlot, she may have been an innkeeper. This is according to Josephus. She may have been both. But this goddess mixed the intoxication with sexuality, which is away from what it should be. That causes a lot of problems in the world today. Ezekiel 8:14. Then he brought me to the door of the gate of the Lord's house, which was toward the north, and behold, there sat women weeping for Tammuz. So when Astarte got angry at her most prominent lover, she brought about his death. Today we would know him as Dionysius, but in Babylonian mythology, he was Tammuz. She was despondent over his death, and being the promiscuous and unfaithful lover, she tried to seduce a hero in the Epic of Gilgamesh. She rejected her, which, as would be expected, also made her angry. When we find her images in the ancient world, the little idols and the statues and things like that, they're almost always naked or revealing, or both. She took what she wanted, and she was fierce. And remember, she was fierce, but she was also the goddess of war. So when her priests and priestesses would worship her, she would seize them and possess them, and they would be the vessels that would serve her will. You want to know why she was so popular? Because her worship was very carnal and, as such, was very sensual and sexual. Her temples were houses of prostitution. At the new year, the kings of Babylon would perform ritual sexual acts with her in her temples through her surrogates, who were priestesses. The women of Babylon were required to sit in the temple and act as prostitutes, performing sex for money with a stranger. They called this sacred sex, but it was temple prostitution, which is also an an idea that most modern churches will gloss over, so that people have no comprehension of what the Bible is talking about when it comes to these things. And because of how scandalous her behavior was, she was a goddess to those on the fringe, but she eventually became mainstream. And that just reminds me of the saying that the more things change, the more they stay the same. What used to be on the fringe in our modern world is now mainstream. But she was able to adapt and change, and so she was able to appear and be successful in other towns and in other nations. And she was popular because the people liked what she was selling. Now, to the Canaanites, she was the wife of Baal, but she was thrown out with the rest of the gods that were in the land when Israel conquered it. Then, when the Christians went out to the nations, she was once again cast out. So, just like the first time, she came back the first time, she's going to come back again. The first time she was invited back. Ecclesiastes 1:9. The thing that hath been, it is that which shall be, and that which is done is that which shall be done. And there is no new thing under the sun. The first time she was invited back, she's going to be invited back the second time. Now, when somebody tells me that the Bible is old or outdated, all I respond with is it's not old, it's timeless. As a backdrop, it tells us what happened, but the emphasis is on what always happens. What happened with Jezebel always happens. And that is why we're given her story as both a type and as a warning. Now, I stated earlier, Jezebel was more interested in adding the two worship systems together instead of outright destroying the worship of Yahweh. Give her more power to put them together. Now, she wanted to destroy the true worship of Yahweh by adulterating it with the pagan worship. What happens when you adulterate water with sewage? All the water gets adulterated. Today in New York City, which is the most populous city in the United States, and is, after a fashion, it's the gate to America. Atop one of the Supreme Court buildings, not the Supreme Court of the United States, this is the Supreme Court of New York, there's a statue of Moses holding the Ten Commandments. Western law is based upon the Bible, and for generations, this stood as a symbol for justice to those who entered the doors of this court. There were included pagan gods as well, but they all conveyed the idea of justice. Also included is a statue of Zoroaster, who was apparently a real person from ancient Persia. I didn't know that. But he gave the world legal principles of evidence and procedure. Things such as arbitration, bail, representation, power of attorney, and execution of wills originated with him. Although there's a possibility that the statue may have been included to represent the religion of Zoroastrianism and not the man himself. Confucius is there as well, which also is a person upon whom a religion was founded. But then in 2023, They added a statue of Medusa. And actually, 2023 is the date of the article. I'm not 100% positive the date of the statue was added, but the article was talking as if it were something new. But this is not even good artwork. Medusa was a Nephilim. She was a Gorgon, and she was mortal, unlike her parents. She was apparently beautiful and had an affair with Poseidon in the temple of Athena, which really irritated Athena. And so she was put on a hit list. Her beautiful hair was replaced with serpents, which would turn men to stone. Never women. There's not a single recorded story in which she turned a woman to stone. But think about the infatuation that the watchers have with women's hair. And this visage was considered to be terrifying. She was beautiful, but also terrifying. Man, if you have a beautiful wife, you should be terrified. I am. But Medusa represented the wrath of women. And any further discussion of this mythology is interesting, but not pertinent. You just have to understand who she was, what she represented, just as a basic outline here. Nothing about justice. Prior to that, in 2020, a statue was added in a park across from a different New York court of Medusa, holding the severed head of Perseus. He was the hero that killed her. He's the one that killed the demon, but instead they have her holding his head. Now, this statue is much more artistic representation. It is nicely done, but she's nude, so I don't have a photo provided here. But when they did this statue, I think it's kind of telling that they chose a Nephilim over the one who slew her. Medusa is one embodiment of the Jezebel spirit. Now, all this is a sign of syncretism, which is what Jezebel was doing. What syncretism is trying to fuse two different religions. Many churches discuss ecumenism at great length, which is trying to reconcile two different Christian sects, but syncretism is a fusion of completely different religions. And like I said, if you have a river of pure water and you dump a little sewage into it, there's no more pure water. So Jezebel wanted to take the pure worship of Yahweh and add Baal worship to it. And this is the spirit that is within our churches today. So what is the result of mixing the worship of God with the worship of a false god? The Bible calls that apostasy. 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, verses 3 through 4. Let no man, let no one, not just man, man's generic there, but let no one deceive you or beguile you by any means. For that day shall not come, except there come a falling away, and the falling away is apostasy. It's rebellion. But there shall come a falling away first. There should not the apostasy be coming first. That the man of sin, the man of lawlessness is doing what's right in one's own eyes. But this man of sin will be revealed, the son of perdition, the son of destruction, who opposeth and exalteth himself. This is not Satan, but it's an agent of Satan. But he exalteth himself above all that is called God. And if it's called God, this is both the one true creator God and the false gods. That's who Satan wanted to be over, all of them. But he's above all that is called God or that is worshipped, so that he as God sitteth in the temple of God, showing himself that he is God, which means he does this publicly, doesn't hide it, he shows it. Now, this passage, there is so much future history that's packed into this passage. Right now, we're going to look at these key points that relate to where we are in the story. But apostasy is rebellion. It is publicly denying a previously held belief. In other words, only Christians or a worldly government that was once based upon Christianity can apostatize. This is not about the unsaved as much as it's about those who are in the family of God, either now or in the past, they've been faithful, or it's about the society that can support that belief. Our society today has determined that the Family Research Council is a hate group. This group is pro-life, they're pro-family, they're about community decency. In our current society, that's considered hate. And that's where we are. The word apostasy has to do with betrayal and treachery, and it's akin to faithlessness. But it has to do, the origin of it has to do with treason and battle. And we are in a battle, brothers and sisters. This is specifically a military term that has to do when a soldier would turn away from their own home and their own people and join the other side. Now, in the Masoretic text, Hosea 14:4 says that God will heal their apostasy. Those who profess to belong to Yahweh but actively and willfully sin and betray him are apostates. You cannot fall away from somewhere that you have never been. And Judas Iscariot is a perfect example of an individual who was close to Jesus, but he became apostate. The only sin that he's accused of is stealing from the money bag. But he betrayed Jesus and what Jesus was teaching. Now, there is some speculation with some justification that his betrayal was a result of his lack of faith in what Jesus was teaching. Basically, he believed that Jesus was the Messiah, but he was simply trying to force Jesus' hand into demonstrating the fact that he was Messiah. He didn't have faith in the plan that Jesus had laid out. I don't know the veracity of that, but no matter what, Judas was close to Jesus and he fell away. Well, Jeroboam was apostate and Ahab followed willingly in his footsteps. They were God's covenanted people. It was a relationship that's a spiritual marriage. It's not a contractual obligation. It's about a relationship. 1 John 4:19. We love him because he first loved us. We respond to his love and we mirror it back at him. And we reflect it upon others. But this is a selfless and sacrificial love. It's the focus of our worship, our obedience, and our mission. Now, when people are unfaithful and they start running around with demons, the Bible calls those people prostitutes and whores. 2 Chronicles 21:13, this is about Jehoram, but has walked in the way of the kings of Israel and has made Judah and the inhabitants of Jerusalem to go a whoring, like to the whoredoms of the house of Ahab, and also has slain thy brethren of thy father's house, which were better than thyself. This is glossed over in most congregations today, but the Bible wants you to know just how bad this apostasy is. God takes it very seriously. And our pulpits teach all of this today. They teach that man is a two-part being and not a three-part being, like the Bible teaches. That's a teaching of natural evolution. They teach deconstructionism, which is a very dangerous form of nihilism that teaches that life has no meaning and leads to destruction of Western values. And they also teach socialism. There's no such thing as Christian socialism in the Bible. From these same pulpits, you will hear all sorts of wokeism, pro-homosexual agendas, and every perversion imaginable, all as being something that's natural. They're social justice warriors. They call themselves that. They're often quite effeminate. They redefine marriage. They redefine gender. They redefine sex. They virtue signal with rainbow flags hanging on church buildings, along with all sorts of other ungodly ideas. They will worship and pray with other religions. You know, I once knew a Methodist preacher, or did they call him priest? But he wore an animal fetish on his robe so that he could connect with the pagan natives that were there. They practice a form of tolerance that has been redefined to embrace anything and everything. They eradicate all lines between darkness and light. And the things that we tolerate today are not taken lightly by God, especially within the church. And these are all of the spirit of Jezebel. Now, you can choose to worship as God says, or you can choose to worship as Jezebel says. Which one are you going to choose? So how did Jezebel and Ahab have so much power to influence the entire nation? Before sin entered the world, our natural physical world was connected with the spiritual world. They were all one realm. Angels and other divine beings went back and forth between the two. And that's why it was perfectly natural for Adam and Eve, part of the natural world, when they were in the garden with God, angels and Satan walking around. The seen and the unseen realm were joined together. Celtic Christians referred to these places where God's presence was strong as thin places. Those are places and times where heaven was closer to earth. And when the divine council came down the ladder to visit Jacob, they called that a thin place. Genesis 28, verses 16 through 17. And Jacob awakened out of his sleep, and he said, Surely the Lord is in this place, and I know it not. And he was afraid and said, How dreadful or how awesome is this place? This is none other but the house of God, and this is the gate of heaven. It's a thin place. So then Jacob named the place Bethel, which means house of God. At the burning bush event, Moses was told to take his sandals off because he was standing on holy ground. The tabernacle and the temple were both thin places where the people of God met God and worship in prayer. The body of Jesus was the literal connecting point between the world, what was seen, and heaven, which is that which is unseen. And today, our bodies should be a thin line based upon what we have in our Holy Spirit. If the Holy Spirit's indwelling us, we should be a thin place. The places where Elijah was protected, they were thin places. When Moses and Elijah came down from heaven to meet with Jesus and his disciples, thin place. Now, just as there are thin places between heaven and earth, there are also high places that are devoted to the demonic. The Temple of Baal in Samaria, Mount Carmel, places like that. Because of their time and proximity to the demonic, Jezebel and Ahab were a bit closer to the darkness in the unseen realm. And this is why they had such power. It's just as if we live in constant prayer and worship, we will be closer to the unseen realm. They lived in constant prayer and worship, therefore, they were closer to the unseen realm. But theirs was the darkness in the unseen realm. James 5:17, this is out of the NET Bible. It says, Elijah was a human being like us, and he prayed earnestly that it would not rain, and there was no rain in the land for 3 years and 6 months. So Elijah is given to us as an example that if we will live in the spirit as he did, we can defeat the demonic. We might not be able to make it stop raining unless God has told us to do so, but we can win the battle in the end. We need to apply this concept to our lives daily. Now, today's study, we're going to end a little bit shorter than normal, which I'm sure will make a few of you happy. But we don't really have time to get into the next section and finish it. And we're going to continue that next week. And don't worry, we are going to look at Ahab and his failings, not just Jezebel's. However, Jezebel is the seductress who will lead people astray in the future. Just as she became the dominant power over Ahab and over Israel, she will become dominant in the world again in the future, maybe the present. Her will was supreme. What she wanted, she got. She was capricious and demanding. She hates God. She hates the people of God, and she hates the prophets of God, and she will persecute them all. She will bring in her own prophets. She will make her own religion supreme over the religion of God, and it will be enforced by the state just as it was with the historical Jezebel. From the time she married Ahab until the apostasy of Israel was complete, all but 7,000 people bowed their knees to Baal. From the time that the church married the state, this is the church of Pergamos, the apostasy that began in the last days of the apostles became so universal that the church and the world were led into the dark ages. Jezebel is corrupt. The church today has effeminate preachers who present the world with very little, if any, biblical doctrine. Oh, it's popular though. You get some sort of feel-good message, and you can sing, and you can wave your hands and hear just how much God loves you just as you are. But it's all false teaching. It is not the only kind of false teaching, but make no mistake about it, it is false teaching. In a recent Barna poll, got the link in the comments below, only 37% of pastors have a biblical worldview. 37%. Interestingly, when I was reading this poll, they actually used the word syncretism, and I came across this poll after I started writing this. They had the same idea. Among Protestant pastors, it's at least 51%, which is better than overall. But among female pastors, it's an appalling 15%. Jezebelianism. Now, among non-pastors, 9% of Christians and 7% of Protestants have a biblical worldview. Let that sink in. 9% of Christians and 7% of Protestants believe the Bible. Plan your warfare accordingly for that. So, what are our preachers doing about it in the churches today? Well, polls show that churchgoers want to understand about abortion, religious persecution, poverty and how to deal with it, restoration of our culture, sexual identity, Israel, Christian heritage, government and how the church relates to it, bioethics, self governance, church and politics, and Islam. That's what they're interested in. What is it that the preachers in the church today avoid? That exact list. They teach everything but that. These effeminate, skinny jean wearing woke pastors, the Jezebel types, and other non biblical church leaders will tell the churchgoers bad information that doesn't come from a biblical worldview. But common sense would tell you that the rest of the preachers and teachers would read about these subjects and apply their biblical worldview to them and know how to speak about them. For example, I read Marx and Nietzsche just in order to understand them and not take someone's word for it. And I can see exactly where they're wrong. But I have to understand it. Therefore, to understand abortion, read books about abortion and apply your biblical worldview to it. Seminaries don't teach that anymore. They used to many years ago. Now they read little of substance and they read a whole lot of spiritual fluff. Fill the pews. Tell them stories about how they're like Eeyore or Piglet, or hire male strippers, or have beer taps in the sanctuary. These are all real world examples, by the way, not exaggerations. They say they're reaching out to the community. Well, what they're doing is they're reaching out to the world or bringing the world in. Instead of image, they should focus on content. And this is a long list of controversial issues that most congregations completely avoid. Oh, we don't want to offend anybody. What would Jesus do? Well, he would whip people, flip over tables, and call them names to start out with. The modern emphasis is on feelings and emotions instead of upon what the Bible actually says. What does it take to get local congregations to speak about these issues? How do we get them prepared for the battle that they should already be engaged in? I have no idea. All I can do is to teach how the Bible is supported by evidence. I can talk about attacks by anti-Christian people or about how the Bible applies to real-world issues. And I can teach you and I can share with you what I've learned. And I can encourage you to do the same. And I can encourage others to do the same. And I can pray. Praying is working. It's doing something. But most modern pastors, they simply are not interested in the most interesting subjects out there because it might rot the boat. After all, they don't want to bite the hand that feeds them. These are things that need to be discussed in church. And to close, I've been accused of being misogynistic toward women in the church, and that's a misunderstanding, either intentional or unintentional, of what I've said. The modern pastor system in modern churches is not biblical. It's not necessarily anti-biblical because it's not prohibited, but the biblical model is a small congregation with multiple elders. Women can be elders, but they are not to play the master. The only office that they're prohibited from is that of bishop or overseer. In the Bible, pastor is a gift, not an office. This is the proper way. I know one church in the bush in Alaska in which all the men are a bunch of alcoholics and the women run the church entirely. They've done a fine job of it, but they are trying to find a man to fill the role of overseer. Interestingly, they've not turned it into an effeminate congregation. This situation is entirely on the men, not the women, but that's not the appropriate way there. But there is an appropriate way. But the Jezebel spirit wants to play the master. And the Jezebels get away with it because they seduce or they deceive others to follow their lead. The historical Jezebel certainly did this successfully. Israel paid the price, and she eventually paid the price too. God gave them both time to repent. God's merciful. He gives us time to repent. Thank God. But do we take advantage of that opportunity to prepare ourselves for our battles? Do we repent and prepare? So Who is the Queen of Heaven? And how does she operate? And we're going to continue with the historical Jezebel and her modern contemporaries next week. I'd like to thank you for being here. I'm praying for you. I hope you're praying for me. Have a good night.